Bye, kids. See you later. We got one. Hey, so glad to have you all here with us today. My name is Seth. I'm one of the pastors. If you're here in the room, watching online, listening in later, you chose a great Sunday to be here, and I'm super excited about what we're going to talk about today. So I'm just curious, if you think back to your life, if you think back to decisions that you've made, have you ever noticed that the majority of bad decisions that you and I make, they often involve other people? You know, when you think back to those times of regret, whether it involved having a little too much to drink or partying a little too hard, or maybe it was spreading the gossip, or maybe it was cheating on a test or cheating on a business deal or breaking the rules, maybe even breaking the law, doing something regrettable, placing a bet. Right? I mean, we can all think back in our lives to times of regret. We can all think back to things we wish we wouldn't have done. And in retrospect, we can see that those come about not because we listened to wisdom. In fact, that's the problem. We didn't listen to wisdom. Our regrets often come because we're listening to our peers. And one of the fascinating things is it doesn't matter if you're a Jesus person or a God person, if you believe in God or don't believe in God. It doesn't matter if you're old or if you're young. Our bad decisions so often are influenced by other people. And isn't it true that if we had listened to different voices, right? I mean, if we had listened to someone else who was a voice of reason, if we had listened to our parents, if we had listened to a wiser friend who made better decisions, if we had listened to someone else, we would have gotten a different result. And because we didn't, we can all admit this, that we all carry baggage from listening to the wrong people. It's just true for all of us, right? Whether it's guilt or regret or shame or legal troubles, hopefully not legal troubles, but, severed relationships, whatever the baggage is that we carry, it all comes typically, not all, but mostly because we listened to the wrong people. So in light of that, today we're going to talk about how to be more discerning to the voices that we listen to, how we can avoid more baggage and therefore have better futures, better fulfillment of our hopes and dreams. And we're going to continue on in our series, Age of Kings. We're actually nearing the end of this series, so next Sunday is going to be, we're going to bring it all to a close. But we've been talking about this period of Israel's history where they were governed by kings. It was roughly 450 years, from 1050 to 586 BC. And what we've been saying as we've been going through this series is that our world has certainly changed, right? There aren't very many monarchies today. Things aren't quite as violent and bloodthirsty today as they were 2,500, 3,000 years ago. But people haven't really changed. I mean, there are some very strong similarities between people then and people now. The same issues that people dealt with then are issues that we deal with now. And so we've been learning some important lessons throughout all of this. And I think one of the most important lessons for all of us is that not a single king from Israel did everything right. Right? I mean, they didn't. They were human, just like you and I are human. In fact, we have my niece and nephew are visiting from out of town, and last night I told the kids a bedtime story. And we were talking about the kings of Israel, and we were talking about how King David, right? He was the ideal king of Israel, even though he was not a perfect king. And the thing that made him ideal wasn't that he was flawless. It wasn't that he never sinned, never did the wrong thing. What made him ideal is that he kept turning his heart back in God's direction. That's not an excuse for us to embrace doing the wrong thing and moving in the wrong direction, but it is an inspiration to say we too, when we discover that we have fallen away, we can move back in the right direction and we can still strive for something better. So if you missed any of those, I want to invite you, you can go online and check those out. I'm excited to tell you about today's king because today's king had so much potential, right? I mean, he was given so much potential, but it's because he listened to the wrong people. The result was disaster. And it wasn't just disaster for himself. I mean, that's kind of one of the lies that we tell ourselves, that we're an island and the decisions that we make just impact us. It's a lie that our culture tells us. You do you. It doesn't impact anyone else. You make your own decisions. You do what's best for number one. The truth is, when we do that, our decisions do impact the sphere of people around us. And nothing could be more true than that for this king of Israel, who ended up impacting not just himself, not just his family, but actually the entire nation of Israel. And so we have to be careful not to forget that our lives do intersect with other people, which is partly why this matters so much, that our decisions impact others, and the consequences that we deal with are also felt by the people we love and we care about. Now, you've probably heard this before, that your environment influences who you are, right? That our environment influences the way we make decisions. It influences the way we look at relationships, the rules by which we kind of operate in our relationships. It influences our language. It influences our behavior, which means that the people in life, that's the environment, right? The people we surround ourselves with matter. And the challenge is we can't always see the role that those people play in the moment. Right? It's only down the road. It's only after we've kind of reaped the consequences, so to speak, of the relationship, as we've reaped the consequences of the decisions that have been influential or they've been influential for us on. Now, sometimes those influences, people can be really positive. And that's a good thing. I hope you've had positive people in your relationship. In fact, I can tell in your life, I can tell you can because I know some of you, and I think you'd be in prison had you not had some positive relationships in your life. But just kidding, right? I'd probably be in prison too. But oftentimes, they're negative. They're negative. And the truth is, as we look back over our lives, we can see people, we can see relationships, we can see influences that have been a part of our lives, and they actually pulled us not in a good direction, but actually in a bad direction. They're the ones who lead us to seasons of regret, decisions we wish we could go back and redo. And so we need to pay attention to this king today because the story we live is influenced by the people around us. And we're going to get an opportunity to get a firsthand look at the damage that the wrong people can have on us when we don't pay attention to wisdom and reason, but instead we listen to ignorance and foolishness. Now, the challenge is, and you probably know this, that we're all acceptance magnets, right? We want to be around people who love us, who accept us. And sometimes, because of our desire to be accepted, we end up surrounding ourselves with people who accept us, but who are not good influences on us. In fact, we place more weight on their opinions, on their decision-making ideas, and what they think we should do than we place sometimes on people of reason. The good news is, as we get older, we hopefully become wiser, and this gets a little bit easier. So some of what we're going to talk about today, it applies especially to the young people in the room, but it applies to us who are older as well. John Maxwell, the leadership guru, he once said that experience is not the best teacher, evaluated experience is. That when we can pay attention to what happens in our lives, if we can gain some perspective, right? Perspective lets us kind of zoom out and see the world a little more fully. It lets us see how our actions, our decisions impact our consequences. For you teenagers in the room, lack of perspective is why your parents get nervous when they see the people you're hanging out with. Because they've been teenagers before. They've been around the block a few times, right? They didn't just fall off the turnip truck. They know, they understand the role of influence of our friends. And they know the power of influence personally. So this is important to know that perspective, it doesn't make you better, right? It doesn't make us better, but it can make us wiser. And so young people, pay close attention to this because you just don't have enough experience for perspective. Hopefully one day you will, but you may not right now. And because of that, we're susceptible to the pull of our peers, to the pull of our culture, because we can't see how it's influencing us yet. So let me tell you about our next king who made the grave mistake of a young person who didn't have perspective. Now, Israel, they started off with one king named Saul. You might remember this. Saul was a man who was not after God's own heart, and so God abandoned him as king. And one day, Saul ended up being mortally wounded in battle. He fell on his own sword, and immediately afterward, David became king. But the nation of Israel was made up of 12 tribes. 12 tribes. Saul was king over all 12 tribes, but not all 12 tribes were ready to welcome David as their king. In fact, only one tribe did. It was the tribe of Judah. So as soon as Saul died, David immediately became the king of Judah, and it took about 7 years of fighting and strife for David to actually become the king of the entire nation of Israel. And so he was the king of all these nations. Eventually he died. He passed the kingdom on to his son Solomon. And when Solomon became king, Solomon kind of was, again, over these 12 tribes of Israel, but there wasn't a lot of unification that came about of kind of building a cohesiveness. And so during Solomon's reign, it was known as the age of, like the golden age of Israel, because there was so much wealth. It said that gold was so prevalent that silver was almost worthless. But in order for this golden age of Israel to be ushered in, it required a lot of work. And the price was paid mostly by the tribes from the northern part of Israel, okay, the tribes of the north. And so Solomon, he built this palace laden with gold. He built temples laden with gold. He had 700 wives, which would make for an awfully interesting reality TV show, wouldn't it? 700 wives and counting. He had 700 wives, and they all need homes to live in, because you can't keep them all in one place. That would not be good, right? There'd be murder. And so they all had their different homes. And so Solomon, he needed to get materials for their homes, and he needed workers to do the homes. And most of these came from the north. In fact, there was a nation north of Israel named Tyre, and Hiram was the king there. And so Solomon hired Hiram's people to come do stuff. He got cedar logs, I believe it was, from Hiram. And in order to pay for all of this, he rationed off some of the cities of the north. So it'd be like, we love our pancakes here, and we need great big vats of maple syrup. And so we negotiate with Canada, give us maple syrup, and we'll give you Michigan. Because nobody cares about Michigan anyway. And then we'll all be happy because we're eating pancakes and watching the Buckeyes win all the time. But sorry, John, that was for you. But you get the idea, right? I mean, people wouldn't be real happy if we auctioned off Michigan. We love people from Michigan, so sorry if I offended you. But the point is that Solomon didn't care. Solomon didn't care. He built his kind of kingdom on the backs of people on the north. So there was a man whose name was Jeroboam. I'm going to put his name on the screen because there's another guy whose name is very similar. Jeroboam, he was a gifted leader from the north, and he was frustrated with King Solomon's policies because he's like, yeah, this is great for you. You get this beautiful palace. Meanwhile, we're killing ourselves, working hard for you. And he saw that the north is paying for everything. So he kind of confronts Solomon. It doesn't go well. He becomes a threat to Solomon. And so Jeroboam flees to Egypt. Meanwhile, Solomon eventually dies, and he has a son named Rehoboam. Okay, that's where it gets a little confusing. Rehoboam is Solomon's son. Jeroboam is the guy who was leading the north, who's now hidden in Egypt. Rehoboam becomes king, and the northern tribes are like, we're not really sure we want you to be our king. Because things didn't go so well during the 40 years your father was over us. And so they sent for Jeroboam to represent themselves to Rehoboam to try and convince him to look at the world a little differently. And so that's where we pick up the text in 1 Kings. Here's what happens. 1 Kings chapter 12 says, So that's the people of the north, they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam, and they said to him, Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. Look, your dad, he did great things for our country, but it was built on our backs. And it was 40 years of difficulty, and we don't want 40 more years of that. So we just need to know, before we commit to you as king, we need to know that you're going to be committed to serving us. So he has this decision to make, right? Rehoboam's got to figure out what to do. So he responds to them, and he answers, Go away for 3 days, and then come back to me. So the people went away. You need time to process. And this is wise, right? This is a wise decision that he makes. So King Rehoboam, he consults with the elders who served his father Solomon during his lifetime. He says, How would you advise me to answer these people? So he goes to these guys who had been around. Some translations actually say the old men. The old men who had been around the block a few times, the old men who had served with Solomon. Again, Solomon was king for roughly 40 years, and so it's possible many of these men had watched Solomon, had advised Solomon, and they saw everything that had happened in the kingdom during this time period. And so they had some perspective, right? They had some perspective on the way Solomon ran things. And so they advised him. They replied, they said, If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them, and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. In other words, Rehoboam, if you can have a little humility and not just make this all about you, which is kind of what your dad did, if you can put their needs first and look to what's important for them, in the end, you will win their hearts and they will serve you. Now, what's fascinating about this advice, because they lived under the reign of Solomon, they saw how Solomon led, but what they're doing really is pointing back to how King David led. King David, who was a shepherd. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, how sheep are helpless creatures. And so a shepherd has to sacrifice himself to care for the sheep. David was known as this shepherd king. In fact, it would be about 1,000 years after this that another shepherd would step onto the scene, Jesus, known as the great shepherd, who would lay down his life for his sheep, for his friends, and who would say, I'm not here for you to serve me, I'm here to serve you. Solomon, however, he kind of saw himself as the king. It's all about me. It's all about me. It's all about what I want. It's all about what's best for me. Now, the advice that these older men give to Rehoboam is money, right? This is good advice. But you know the problem with this advice? It's not very exciting, is it? If you've kind of got visions and dreams of grandeur, if you get to be king someday and people are going to fan you and feed you grapes while they build your palaces, and when you've got aspirations of power and you see how your dad has operated and it's been like, serve me, do what I want, he's beginning to think, hey, it's my turn now, right? In fact, I think there's kind of a piece in all of us that can relate of like, I want to sit in first class and have people serve me and wait on me hand and foot. I want this special treatment. That's why we like watching celebrities and influencers and seeing what they're doing, because they're living this life we wish we could live. And now it's within Rehoboam's grasp, right? He's got it right there. And they're saying, no, to be, serve them. No. And yet again, when Jesus walked the earth, he said, hey, you want to be great in God's kingdom? You're going to serve. You want to be first, you got to make yourself last. They gave him wise advice, but it didn't stick, right? It wasn't enticing to him. I think in part because the environment we're around influences who we become, and he was around other people who saw the world a little differently. So he reached out to his peers to let them weigh in. Here's what the text tells us. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him, and they consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and who were serving him. And so he said this, continuing on, what is your advice? How should we answer these people? Now, I don't know if you caught the first time around, Rehoboam said, how would you advise me to answer? And now he's saying, how should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke your father put on us? It's almost like Rehoboam's like, this is our time, right? This is our chance. This is our kingdom. We get to make the decisions now. We get to call the shots. We get to be in charge. Any of you seen the movie The Goonies? Goonies, back in the 80s, right? That was fascinating movie. But there's a point in time where the kids are down in these tunnels looking for the ship, and they're like being called to by their parents. And they're like, no. We're down here, and when we're down here, we call the shots. And if we do what they want us to do, then we lose all this, right? This is our time. This is our time. This is our chance. I'm sick of being told what my curfew is going to be. I'm sick of being told who my friends should be, what movies I can watch, what language I can use, how I should dress, who I'm allowed to date, if we're allowed to move in together, what our future should hold, how I should raise my kids, if I should be going to church or not, right? I am so tired of being told what to do. This is our chance to do what we want to do. The funny thing about that attitude is I think every generation has felt that before. Doesn't matter how old you are. There's a point in time where you're like, oh, I'm tired of being told what to do by the older generation. We got to figure this out on our own. The problem is that the older generation has some perspective that you don't have. They've seen world events. They've lived through world events that you've only read about or watched on television. And so Rehoboam's peers, they didn't have much perspective. The young men who had grown up with him, replied, "These people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Now tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I'll make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." Now, a scorpion is a whip that has little shards attached to the end of it. So it's like, even my whip is going to be harsher than my father's because I'm king and you're going to do what I tell you to do. Now, here's the thing. I don't even need to fast forward to the end of the story. You don't even have to be old to recognize this is not very good advice, is it? Right? I mean, you young people, you're smart. You're smart. You know this is terrible advice. So why would he listen to this? It's a great question, isn't it? Why do we listen to the input of people around us who are leading us to bad decisions? I think so often we've just insulated ourselves. We've surrounded ourselves with an echo chamber, and we hear what we want to hear. We do what everyone else is telling us to do without paying attention to where it might lead us. See, Rehoboam, he saw leadership as power, and he was going to leverage and wield his power over other people, which history tells us leads people to rebel. And so the northern kingdoms, right, they had no obligation to stay with him, and so they opted for something different. But first he told the people the answer. Here's what happened. The king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given by the elders. He followed the advice of the young men. He said, "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I'll scourge you with scorpions." And this decision, these words, sealed the fate, not just for Rehoboam and his kingship. He sealed the fate for the nation of Israel because he did not anticipate the backlash that was coming. He did not anticipate that they were going to have none of that. You know, it's okay if you don't have perspective, if you pay attention to people who do. But Rehoboam didn't pay attention, and the backlash was fierce. The text tells us when all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king. Here's what they said: "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son?" Like, what obligation do we have for David's household to be our king? Because Rehoboam came from that household. "To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. 11 tribes at that point in time left. Eventually, one would stick with Rehoboam. Now, he wasn't very happy about this, and so he tried to send someone up to whip these northerners into shape, right? And the text tells us that King Rehoboam sent Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor. "I'm going to force you into it." But all Israel stoned him to death. And so King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot, and he escaped off into the wilderness, into Jerusalem. And again, the tragedy here is the nation of Israel was permanently split in two. There was a near civil war. Thankfully, it didn't come to that. But they were divided forever because of the foolish decision to listen to his peers. Now, the thing is, when people influence us and when we make decisions based on what they lead us to do, the consequences aren't always immediate, are they? I mean, they're eventual. And the reality for all of us is that you're living with consequences of past decisions influenced by past people. Whether that was 3 months ago, 3 years ago, 3 decades ago. And we listened to them and we didn't know the damage that it was going to cause and how we would carry that years and years and years into the future. Rehoboam had no idea. He had no idea the long-lasting ramifications. And it gets worse than this. We're going to talk next week about that as we close the series out. And that's why we have to pay such close attention. But I think it begs a really important question for all of us. And the question is, how do I know? How do you know who to listen to? How do you know who to listen to then? How do you know whose approval to seek, whose opinions and influences go into you? And I think the answer to that goes back to what we talked about when King Saul lost the kingship. And what we said is that God is looking for someone who's looking for him. God was looking for someone who is looking for him, which is why King Saul could no longer be king. That's why David was selected as king, because David was someone who was looking for God and trying to please him. And so in order to answer this question, I can just tell you who I want to influence me. I want someone who is looking for God and trying to please him. The people that I want to influence my life are the people who are actively looking for God and trying to please him in the way that they live out their marriage, in the way that they parent their children, in the way that they handle their finances, in the way that they pursue after him in their devotional life, in the way that they grandparent, in the ways that they look toward retirement, in the ways that they, again, raise their kids in the culture that we live in the ways that they handle health crises that eventually come up. People who know that how they live matters. Those are the people that I want to influence me in my life. Sometimes those people are older than me. Sometimes they're younger. It doesn't matter. What I want in common with all of them is that they're seeking to please God. You know, one of the unique things about our current time in history, because of internet and speeding up of information and whatnot, we actually, for the first time in the history of the world, I read, we have 6 generations living today. The silent generation, the boomers, the Gen X, the millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha. And because of that, we actually have all 6 generations in our congregation now. And we have a unique opportunity to learn from one another. You know, the internet has made it possible for younger generations to ignore older ones, right? Because I can just go to the Google to get my answers to life and the problems that I have. But the problem is Google doesn't always have wisdom. In fact, maybe we could say often it does not. TikTok often does not have wisdom. Social media often does not have wisdom. And it's easy to go to those other voices, but those other voices aren't necessarily people who are looking for God and seeking to please him in all that they do. And we have a risk of paying attention to the wrong voices. And it's not a big deal if you're just fixing a leaky faucet. But again, when you're fixing a broken marriage or a struggling marriage, when you're raising hormonal teenagers, or now your parents trying to parent your grown children, those are not the places to look. So we have both an invitation and an opportunity to say, I want to look for someone and say, I see you're someone who's looking for God, and you're trying to please him in the way that you live your life. And so because of that, I want you to be an influence in who I am. I've shared this before, but every Tuesday for the last 10 years, I've gone out to the Springs, a retreat center that's a ministry partner of ours in Dick and Sybiltown. In fact, Miss Sybil was mentioned in the baptism video. It was so beautiful. They are such incredible people. And one of the blessings for me of going out there every Tuesday is that I get a chance to work on my sermons and have focused time, but then I'll have lunch with Dick and Sybil, or I'll have or talk to them before breakfast time or later before I go, and I'll just talk about, hey, I'm dealing with this situation in my life. I'm dealing with this situation in my relationship with God, in my parenting, in our marriage, leadership situation. How do you think I should handle it? What wisdom can you offer me? Because I look at them as people who are looking for God and they are seeking to please him in all that they do. But they're not the only ones I look to. They're not the only ones. I'm privileged to be pursuing and finding other people throughout our congregation and outside of our congregation who are looking for God and seeking to please him. That is the benefit of a multi-generational church, that we do not have to be surrounded just by an echo chamber of the same voices, but that we can listen to the wisdom of others. In fact, one of our unwritten parenting goals is that we want our kids to have the same experience. And so this last semester in our community group, we had a young gal, Josie, who did our baptism. We reached out to Josie and said, you know what, we've got 4 girls who are in 4th and 5th grade. Would you come meet with our girls and just pour into them? Because we see you're a person who loves God and is seeking to please him. And would you pour into them every night as we're having community group? And she did, and it was such a beautiful thing, and I am so thankful for it. We have to be listening to other generations. We have to be listening to other voices. And just because you're from an older generation doesn't mean there aren't some young voices that are worth listening to. About 1,000 years after King Rehoboam was on the scene, the Apostle Paul stepped on, and he wrote a letter to the church in Ephesus. Take a look at what he wrote. This is so beautiful. He says, be very careful, not just a little bit careful, be very careful then, he says, how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Paul doesn't say the days are neutral. Paul doesn't say the people around you are neutral, that they're generally moving in a positive direction. He says the days are evil. And so because of that, we have to be very careful. We have to consider how we live. We have to choose to be wise. The pressure we face around us is not in the direction of wisdom. Young people, the pressure you face around you is not in the direction of wisdom. So you have to choose. You have to choose and say, I'm going to surround myself with people who are going to move me in the right direction. We all have an influence from our past that was not a good influence. And we had no idea how we would carry that with us today. So let's move forward differently. Let's move forward differently. This is why we all have to pay attention to who you pay attention to. It's why we all need to pay attention. Stick this up here. Pay attention to who you pay attention to. Two quick things I want to encourage you with. If you're trying to figure out who do you pay attention to, who's influencing in your life, one of the best things you can do is get involved in a community group. A community group that meets together every other week or so. It's an opportunity to gather with a group of people who say, I am pursuing Jesus, I love Jesus, I want his involvement, and I want to please him in how I live my life. Our new pastor, Scott Rosen, is going to be overseeing community groups. We're going to be kicking off new groups this fall. For those of you who don't have a group yet, you can scan the QR code and sign up for a group. I can just tell you it is one of the biggest blessings of my life, the groups that we have been in the past and continue to be in now. The second one is join a serving team. We don't just serve individually here. We work together as a team. And one of the values of the multi-generational church that we have is that we get to interact with other generations when we're on a team together. And it's not just showing up and doing a job, it's connecting with the people around you. And so we want to invite you to do that. I don't know what you carry from your past, but I do know that there is a group of people from your past who have helped you carry it, and you're living consequences because of that group of people. And so now we have an opportunity to move forward differently. We have an opportunity to recognize wisdom, to gain some perspective and say, I want to have some different influences in my life. And then before you go, maybe more importantly, I just need to ask you this question. Are you looking for God? And are you trying to please him? It's a question to sit with. Depending on your faith background, maybe you're just here at church, you're trying to figure things out, and I'm so glad you're here. I hope you'll wrestle with this. What you should know is that Rehoboam was not looking for God and trying to please him. And it led not only to the downfall of his kingdom, it led down to the downfall of the nation of Israel, and things got awfully, awfully bleak. But the good news is, 1,000 years later, through the seed of David, through the seed of Jesse, comes this hope of Jesus, who came not simply to forgive us of our sins, but to set us free from the power of sin so that we can move forward differently. And now we can move forward with a vastly different story. So pay attention to who you're paying attention to. And are you looking for someone? Are you looking for him and seeking to please him in all you do? Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, thank you for this account that was recorded for us, as hard as it was for the people of Israel during that time who were led by this king who made such a foolish decision. God, I pray that you would protect us. Every one of us can look to choices we've made in the past and the people who have been a part of those choices and know that it has not always been good. God, move us in a direction of wisdom, knowing that this is not going to happen accidentally, that we have to be so intentional about who we surround ourselves with. God, give us courage to surround ourselves with someone different. Give us courage to surround ourselves with people who are looking for you and who are seeking to please you. And God, would that be true of every one of us, that we would be looking for you and seeking to please you? Give us wisdom to know what we need to do. Give us courage to do it, God. pray in Jesus' name. Amen.